Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of historical deep dives that are about as useful as a chocolate teapot in a heat wave. We're here to unpack some truly unnecessary facts you absolutely won't remember tomorrow, but for now, let's pretend we're gaining some profound insights. Today, let's talk about what being in a Roman legion was really like. Spoiler alert, you didn't sign up for this, at least not willingly, and no, there's no dramatic rescue or epic escape. It's more like getting drafted into a sweat-soaked, blisters and mud-themed hell with a 25-year subscription. If you're listening from your car or sneaking this in during a late-night shift, or maybe just lying awake wondering why sandals have to be so damn uncomfortable, welcome. Feel free to drop a comment and let me know where you're at, whether you're procrastinating or actively regretting your life choices. It helps to know I'm not alone in this madness. Alright, picture this. You're minding your own business, maybe tending some farm or avoiding the plague, when suddenly, boom, you've been recruited. No, that's not the polite military recruitment you see on TV, where they flash patriotic slogans and smooth-talking recruiters hand you shiny brochures. Roman legion recruitment was closer to being cornered by a very persistent street vendor selling socks that smell like ancient cheese. Most of these volunteers were really conscripts, which is the polite way of saying they got strong-armed into it. Sometimes they were criminals or slaves bribed with promises of freedom, citizenship, or land. In reality, those promises were about as reliable as a modern politician's diet plan. You might get a citizenship certificate in your old age, assuming you survived the meantime. But chances are you'd spend more time polishing sandals than polishing your new citizenship papers. Recruiters were skilled in the ancient art of creative paperwork. Your age might magically change from 46 to 18, or your name might get slightly adjusted to sound more Roman. Because nothing says welcome to the Legion like realizing you're officially 15 years younger and signed up for 2 decades of forced marches and questionable rations. Imagine your ID being edited by someone who barely passed 3rd grade handwriting class and thought Marcus sounded more impressive than Gaius, even if you never said yes to any of this. Once you're official, you take the sacramentum, which is a fancy Latin word for I totally surrender my will to some dude I just met. This oath binds you to obey your commander more loyally than your own mother or your neighbour who's been sneaking your goat's milk for years. From that moment, your individuality is less useful than a waterproof tea bag. You're now part of the machine, a walking tool of Roman imperialism, and no longer a person with hobbies or weekend plans. Now, you arrive at camp where the welcoming committee greets you with hair clippers and razors. That glorious mop you used to call your hair? Gone. The beard you were sort of proud of, shaved off like you were a bad actor in a low-budget gladiator film. This wasn't about hygiene, though trust me, that came later and was still questionable. This was about control. No one escapes the buzz cut. You become instantly recognizable as a fresh recruit, a walking, moaning, bald target. Next, your clothes get tossed like yesterday's breadcrumbs, and you're issued the classic Roman legionary uniform. That includes the tunica, basically a rough, scratchy wool shirt that probably smelled like a wet dog and mouldy cheese had an unholy union. Then come the caligae, those infamous hobnailed leather sandals that sound like they should be comfortable, but are actually like wearing medieval torture devices on your feet. Imagine stepping into a pair of flip-flops made from recycled leather straps stolen from a particularly cranky goat with nails poking out the bottom. Lovely. You're also given a wooden training sword, which is basically a stick with dreams of stabbing glory. Before you get to the exciting stuff like actual weapons, you start with stabbing air, or, more precisely, stabbing wooden posts. Picture a bunch of sweaty, awkward men repeatedly jabbing a tree trunk while a grumpy centurion shouts in a voice that sounds like a chainsaw stuck in gravel. No one's winning any style points here. This is hard work disguised as martial arts. Marching is next. But not just any marching. hours and hours of marching in formation. You know how you get restless after 5 minutes of walking? Try doing it all day with heavy gear strapped to you under a Mediterranean sun that feels like it's personally trying to kill you. The Roman march wasn't a leisurely stroll to the corner store. It was more like being in a relentless, sweaty conga line where the prize for falling behind was getting yelled at loudly enough to question your life choices out loud. And you don't just carry a small pack. You lug around about 40 kilograms of gear. That's roughly the weight of a medium-sized dog, a small child, or your overdue library books, if you're into that sort of thing. Included in this joyful load is your shovel, because apparently soldiers double as construction workers, a saw, a cooking pot, your ration packs, and the faint hope you'll someday have clean socks again. Spoiler alert, socks were not a Roman thing. Camp life offered zero respite. You slept on the dirt with no mattress or pillow, just your clothes folded awkwardly under your head if you were lucky. Hygiene? Well, the latrines were basically a trench shared by dozens of men, located conveniently close enough for the scent to remind you to stay hydrated, but far enough to remind you that privacy was a Roman joke. Bathing was irregular at best, because people believed too much washing would somehow kill you. So many soldiers smelled like a dumpster that lost a fight with a skunk. It was an aromatic symphony of sweat, mouldy bread, and what could only be described as despair. Discipline was enforced with a brutal efficiency that would make modern military drill sergeants sweat with envy. Fail to keep formation, beating. Slow on the march, beating. Look tired, beating. Apparently, Roman commanders mistook exhaustion for insubordination, and their solution was to hit you until you got the message, or fainted from pain, whichever came first. Your personal space, dignity, and hopes for comfortable footwear were all sacrificed on the altar of Roman order. By the end of your first week, you're not so much a man as a mobile brick in Rome's relentless war machine. Your brain probably starts to resemble the muddled fog of someone who's had 3 cups of bad coffee in a row and then been told to sprint uphill for no reason. But if you think this is bad, you ain't seen nothing yet. The real fun comes when you actually get to march longer, carry heavier loads, and maybe, just maybe, start to understand why those sandals are considered ancient torture devices. Welcome to the Roman Legion. Population U. The only way out is either death, desertion, which gets you clubbed or worse, or 25 years of uncomfortable misery. Spoiler, none of those are good options. So now that you've had your personality surgically removed and your limbs deemed replaceable, welcome to the real meat grinder, the Roman Legion's daily life of marching and carrying a pack so heavy it feels like you're hauling a small, angry mule strapped to your back. Imagine this, about 40 kilograms of gear. And no, I'm not exaggerating. That's roughly the weight of a toddler who's decided to throw a tantrum and refuses to be carried properly. In your pack, you've got your trusty shovel. Yes, because you're not just a soldier. You're a landscaper, a carpenter, and a medieval Swiss Army knife. There's also a saw, your cooking pot, which probably smells like a mix of burnt porridge and sad desperation, rations that have seen better centuries, and, of course, your sandals. More on those later because they deserve a special kind of misery. Now, you'd think with all this baggage, maybe the Romans gave their legionaries some kind of modern hiking gear, a hydration pack, a power bar, maybe some trail mix. Nope. Your water is posca, which is basically vinegar water. If you've ever accidentally taken a swig of pickle juice straight from the jar when you were 5 and thought, yeah, this could be a drink, congrats, you're almost there. Posca is supposed to hydrate and disinfect, but mostly it just tastes like regret. The marching orders are brutal, about 20 miles a day. And no, you can't stop to catch your breath, to cry quietly, or to discreetly curse your ancestors who thought this was a good idea. The centurion, who somehow survived despite being the loudest and most terrifying human being within a 50-mile radius, will make sure you keep moving. If you slow down, expect an eloquent reminder that your family probably forgot you already if you ever had one. And just when you think, okay, finally, maybe I get to rest, the Romans laugh in your face. Because after those 20 miles, you now have to build a fortified camp for the night, the castrum. Picture a group of grown men, utterly exhausted, sweating more than a sunbather stuck in a wool sweater, digging a moat with their shovels, raising a palisade with wooden stakes, and doing it all with the kind of military precision that would make your local Home Depot seem disorganized. Every soldier has a specific job. And if one guy screws up, if someone puts a stake in the wrong place or forgets to dig a section of the ditch, everyone pays. Punishments range from extra digging duty to whatever terrible thing the centurion feels like inventing that day, which usually involves shouting and threats to send you to some frozen swamp to fend off poisonous snakes. And what does rest in this camp look like? Well, after you've spent all day marching and digging, you collapse onto the ground, which is full of mud, horse manure, and enough bugs to make you question every life decision that got you here. Your bedroll is a thin blanket that barely keeps the cold out, and your only protection from the night's horrors is the palisade you just built, which is about as comforting as a chain-link fence at a toddler's birthday party. Oh, and about those sandals. Roman caligae. These are open-toed leather shoes that look like they were designed by someone who hates feet. They offer zero arch support and basically act as blister incubators. Imagine wearing sandals made from straps tougher than your average barbed wire and walking on every imaginable terrain, rocky hills, muddy plains, and sometimes even snow, because the Romans apparently never heard of seasonal footwear. The result? Legionaries had feet that looked like a medieval horror show, blisters the size of small eggs, sores that refused to heal, and the famous March foot, which is exactly as delightful as it sounds. Think of it like Trenchfoot's distant, uglier cousin who decided to crash the party uninvited. And none of this was optional. You were expected to march those 20 miles every day, rain or shine, sunburned or frostbitten, happy or quietly wishing you'd never learned to read so you wouldn't understand what fate awaited you. So, what kept these poor souls going? Discipline mostly. The Roman military machine ran on fear, routine, and a healthy dose of sadism disguised as training. Imagine being screamed at all day by a centurion whose voice sounds like it's been scraping a chalkboard for centuries, who also has the emotional range of a stone wall. And if you messed up, missed a step, dropped your gear, or looked even remotely tired, you were probably in for a beating because physical punishment was the Roman version of constructive feedback. Now, before you get too sympathetic, remember that this training created one of the most efficient and terrifying armies the world had ever seen. They took what modern militaries would call grueling and made it standard. You didn't sign up for a leisurely stroll. You joined a machine that was designed to grind men down and spit out empire builders. But just when you think you've reached peak suffering, the fun's only beginning, because the real physical trauma wasn't the marches, the blisters, or the mud baths at night. It was when you finally got to learn how to fight. And let me tell you, it's not the Gladiator show you binge watch on streaming services while eating snacks on your couch. That, my friend, is a story for another time. But suffice to say, if you thought marching 20 miles with a backpack full of bricks was bad, wait until you meet the gladius and the training post. You know that feeling when you think, okay, I've marched 20 miles, built a moat, and barely managed not to lose a toe to blisters. Surely now I get to learn how to actually fight. Spoiler alert, you're right. But the reality of Roman combat training is less Russell Crowe in a breeze, and more repetitive stabbing drills that make a modern-day office job look like an adrenaline rush. See, the Roman legion wasn't about fancy sword swings or heroic duels like in the movies. No, the star of the show was the gladius. It's a short, stabbing sword, basically the medieval equivalent of a precise, brutal butter knife designed to turn anyone it touched into a very permanent pile of bad decisions. Forget about flashy fencing moves or broad sweeping cuts. Roman soldiers were drilled to thrust that thing into an enemy's torso with the same enthusiasm you might muster when trying to open a stubborn jar of pickles at 2 a.m. And how did they get that good? By stabbing giant wooden logs over and over. Not once or twice, but for hours. Picture this. You, sweating in full armour that's about as comfortable as hugging a cactus in a wool sweater, clutching your gladius and repeatedly jabbing at a wooden post. The log probably smells like a mixture of rotting sap and every bad decision a carpenter ever made, but hey, it's your new best friend. The centurion overseeing this circus was the embodiment of mood swings and rage, with a voice loud enough to shatter glass and a temper that probably qualified him for ancient PTSD. Miss your mark? Whack, move too slow. Whack, look like you want to cry. Whack! And no, these weren't light taps. Imagine the kind of beatings that would have you rethinking every life choice that led you to this glorified stabbing practice. Now, in theory, this all made sense. When the battle finally came, you wouldn't be slashing at enemies like you were cutting vegetables. You'd be stabbing with precision, like an angry chef trying to kill an onion before it kills him. Romans were taught to aim for the enemy's vital organs, ideally piercing the lungs or heart, because nothing says efficient killing quite like 1,000 guys lining up and shoving their pointy sticks into the same unfortunate person until he stopped twitching. Charming, right? Forget about the epic one-on-one duels you see in movies. The reality was more like an aggressive conga line, where soldiers in a tight shield wall shoved forward relentlessly. If you tripped and fell, congratulations, you were basically a human pincushion. The guy behind you probably didn't care much either. He just kept stabbing until the job was done. It's less brave heroism and more mob mentality with swords. You'd think after hours of repetitive stabbing drills, a soldier might at least get some flair points for style or creativity. Oh, no, darling. That's how you get beat with a stick. The Legion had zero tolerance for flair. Just stab, the centurion said, and stab again, like a very determined porcupine. If you tried to get fancy with your sword, you'd probably lose a finger, or worse, the centurion's approval, which was about the same thing. Meanwhile, the whole process was designed to turn you into a human weapon, stripping away any hint of individuality. Your personality was less useful than a screen door on a submarine. And the irony? This very grind made the Roman army one of the deadliest fighting forces the world had ever seen. And it wasn't just stabbing logs. They practiced formation fighting too, but even that was less about choreographed moves and more about brute force and stamina. You'd be packed into the testudo formation. That's the infamous tortoise shield wall, shoulder to shoulder, praying that the guy next to you didn't have a cold or worse. Because if he sneezed, you might lose the entire front line. No room for fancy footwork or personal space here. Oh, and remember those sandals from earlier? The open-toed leather straps that looked like they were made for a lazy stroll in Rome, but instead got dragged through mud, blood, and probably someone's lunch. Those same sandals were worn while stabbing wooden posts in armour, marching miles, and eventually in actual combat. If you thought trench foot was a modern problem, think again. Romans invented it first, courtesy of wet, blistered feet trapped in leather that offered about as much protection as a soggy paper bag. Also, don't forget the fun little extras, like the fact that every now and then you'd get to practice stabbing while dragging a weighted pack that felt like the Empire's entire budget strapped to your back. because nothing says combat ready like muscle fatigue and the kind of sweat stains that leave permanent art on your tunic. The drills and marches were brutal enough to break most men physically, but the real kicker? This wasn't training for a weekend. It was years of relentless, grinding preparation designed to make you a killing machine. If you thought your high school gym teacher was mean, try having a centurion yelling at you while your shoulders are burning from swinging a sword for the 10,000th time. So, when you finally got sent somewhere, probably cold, muddy, and smelling like 3-day-old barley, you'd be ready. Or as ready as a man can be when he's got blisters on top of blisters, a leather thong sandwich on his feet, and a deep-seated desire to never stab anything ever again. That's the glorious reality of Roman combat training. Not swords swinging dramatically in the sun, but endless, monotonous stabbing under the glare of a centurion who probably hadn't slept since the last emperor was alive. And while it might sound like a torture method designed by someone with a particularly grim sense of humour, it worked, terrifyingly well. Because when it came to war, the Roman army didn't care about your feelings, your dreams, or whether your toes had given up on life. It just cared about whether you could stab a wooden post until your arms fell off, and then do it again the next day. And when that training was done, you didn't exactly get a trip to a tropical beach or a cozy inn. No, you got shipped off to some freezing, miserable outpost where your fellow legionaries smelled like spoiled barley, bad decisions, and the faint, haunting scent of regret. But hey, at least there were no arrows flying at your face. Yet. All right, so you finally made it out of training. Beautiful. You now know how to march, dig holes, and stab a wooden post until your arms feel like wet noodles. And now, it's time for the part they put on the recruitment poster. You know, the glorious battlefield. Except no one mentioned it would smell like armpit soup, wet leather, and at least 3 different kinds of human terror. Because here's the thing about ancient warfare. It's not organized, cinematic, or noble. It's a sweaty, screamy meat blender where people yell, bleed, and soil themselves, sometimes in that order, sometimes not. Let's start with the ambience. Imagine the sound of 1,000 sandals slapping against dry dirt, mixed with the clatter of armour, shouted Latin commands, and the very specific noise a man makes when he realises he forgot to put his helmet on. It's part panic, part shame, and all nasal. The dust is so thick you can't see more than a few feet ahead. Your eyes sting, your mouth tastes like powdered bronze, and someone behind you keeps muttering prayers to Mars like he's trying to negotiate a discount on divine intervention. You're packed shoulder to shoulder in formation. No, not like a team. More like a human panini press. The guy to your left smells like fermented onions. The one on your right has clearly been crying. And in front of you? That's Gaius. He wet himself. Again, that makes 3 times this week, but nobody cares, because the only thing that matters now is holding the line. Roman warfare wasn't about individual heroism. It was about geometry, grids, repetition. It was less hero charges forward with a battle cry, and more rectangle of men slowly pushes into enemy while poking them like a horrifying meat-based Roomba. Let's talk about the testudo, or as it should have been called, suffocation with friends. You and your buddies hold your shields over your heads and around your sides, forming a protective shell. Great for blocking arrows. Not so great for breathing, moving, or seeing anything except the back of someone's suspiciously hairy neck. And I do mean suspiciously. It looked like someone glued a squirrel pelt to his spine. But you don't have time to judge because someone just screamed, "Incoming!" and now you're holding that shield like your mum's favourite vase during an earthquake. Arrows slam into the formation with a sound somewhere between thud and oh no. If you're lucky, they bounce off the shield. If you're unlucky, well, then you get to find out what bronze tastes like. And speaking of unlucky, let's discuss injuries. Roman battlefield medicine was a creative mix of superstition, desperation, and tools that looked like they were stolen from a medieval torture museum. You get an arrow in the leg, they'll pour vinegar on it, say a prayer to Asclepius, and then go elbow deep with a pair of bronze tongs that haven't been cleaned since Julius Caesar was in diapers. You could survive getting stabbed, sure, but then you'd die a week later when your leg turned purple, sprouted a weird smell, and started whispering secrets to you at night. Because remember, antibiotics wouldn't exist for another 1800 years. The best medical advice they had was, don't bleed too much, and try not to die before sunset. And then there's the footwear. Roman sandals, caligae, which were essentially leather strappy nightmares that offered the same support as a wet paper towel taped to your foot. They were open-toed, because of course they were, and had iron hobnails hammered into the sole, ideal for turning your already blistered feet into something resembling burnt bacon. Imagine hiking across rocky terrain, swampy mud, or frozen winter ground in what is basically an artisanal flip-flop designed by someone who hates you. Your feet swell, your skin cracks, the blisters get infected, and then your centurion yells at you for limping like a pathetic goat with gout. But hey, on the bright side, you're also wearing 30 kilos of armor. So, if the blisters don't get you, gravity eventually will. Now, the Roman helmet did offer decent protection, assuming you weren't already half deaf from all the shouting, but the inside of that helmet, a delightful combination of stale sweat, dried blood, and whatever creature crawled in there last night to die. And no, there was no such thing as a chin strap. It was just, hope this stays on while you run directly into danger, which shockingly did not always work. As the battle goes on, things get sticky. There's mud, blood, maybe some vomit, possibly yours, and that ever-present dust turning everything into a sort of human gravy. You don't know if that thing you stepped on was a helmet, a rib cage, or a chicken. Doesn't matter. Keep stabbing. At some point, the formations start to break down. Someone panics. Someone else drops their shield. There's a gap. Your centurion shouts something obscene involving your mother and a donkey. And suddenly, it's not a battle. It's a bar fight with swords. The enemy charges, you brace, shields crash. There's a loud grunt, a wet crunch, and you're being shoved so hard your nose touches the inside of your own skull. Your gladius strikes something, maybe flesh, maybe tree, and you realize for the first time that you forgot everything you learned in training because your brain is currently busy screaming. And yet, the line holds, because Roman soldiers didn't win battles with flair. They won with pure, joyless consistency. They drilled until they could stab in their sleep. Which is helpful, because some of them probably were asleep, sleep-deprived, concussed, or just spiritually dead inside. When it's all over, if you're still standing, you look around and realize you've just participated in a bloodbath where the grand strategy amounted to push forward until they stop moving. And somehow, it worked. But you don't get to rest. No. You drag your bruised, blistered, emotionally crippled self back to camp, which you now have to rebuild. Again. Dig the trench, pitch the tent, pretend your ankle isn't turning the colour of an old plum. Because if you ask for a break, the answer is always the same. You can rest when you're dead. Oh, and don't even think about skipping sentry duty. One guy tried that. He accidentally got assigned latrine cleaning with a broken spoon and a bag of salt for a week. So yes, battlefield glory is technically a thing, but mostly it smells like sweat, fear, and other people's bodily fluids. And your reward for surviving? More marching, more digging, more existential dread. And if you're lucky, really lucky, you might live long enough to experience the true highlight of a Roman legionary's career, retirement, which is a word that sounds relaxing, until you realize it involves dirt farming, broken knees, and the Empire possibly forgetting you exist. But that, my exhausted friend, is a horror for another day. But for now, you've made it. 25 years of blood, sweat, and whatever bodily fluids leaked out of the guy next to you. You didn't die of dysentery, frostbite, gangrene, or boredom. You marched across deserts, swamps, and mountain passes in shoes that were basically decorative leather potholders. You stabbed things, dug holes, marched some more, and occasionally got paid in what historians generously call coin. And now you get to retire, which sounds good until you realize what retirement meant for a Roman legionary. Spoiler alert, there's no beach house, no pension checks, and definitely no golf. The closest you're getting to a peaceful sunset is collapsing face down in your cabbage patch while reminiscing about the time your best friend got hit by a flaming javelin. See, the Roman army did promise its soldiers rewards, and to be fair, the promise was technically fulfilled, just creatively. Most veterans were offered a plot of land, in theory. Land you could farm and live on and maybe pass to your kids, assuming it wasn't already inhabited by several thousand angry locals who disagreed with the whole Rome owns this now concept. Let's say you were stationed in some remote corner of the empire, maybe Dacia or Britannia, or the mosquito-infested left armpit of Gaul. When your discharge papers came through, if they came through, the Roman authorities might hand you a lovely map with your new farm marked in red. Congratulations, you're now the proud owner of a rectangle of dirt that floods in the spring and grows exactly one angry shrub per year. And building your retirement villa, that's on you. No assistants, no construction crew, just you, a rusty spade, and the architectural knowledge of a man who spent the last 2 decades smashing things with a sword. Most of these homes look like what happens when you give a toddler a pile of sticks and say, build a fort. If it kept the wind out and the bears mostly out, you were ahead of the curve. But maybe you got lucky. Maybe the local barbarians didn't set fire to your hut. Maybe your land wasn't just rocks and regrets. Maybe, just maybe, the pension came through. A modest sum of coins delivered months or years after you needed them, often with inflation so bad it could barely buy a loaf of stale bread and a sour look from the baker. And what if you weren't lucky? Well, then retirement didn't really happen. Some veterans were simply kept on the rolls because someone in an office, probably wearing a toga with wine stains and a deep hatred of paperwork, forgot to process your release, and the army doesn't like ambiguity. So if they're not sure you're retired, guess what? You're not. Now you're 50 years old, you have a limp, 3 teeth, and a sword arm that clicks like an old wooden chair. And suddenly you're being recalled to active duty because some governor in Syria picked a fight with the Parthians, and they need experienced men. Which is a nice way of saying people who already know how to die in rows. Some veterans ended up wandering back to Rome, hoping to cash in their service for a little honour or charity. But Rome, as it turns out, is very bad at eye contact when you're poor. Begging outside the forum, wearing the faded remains of your legionary tunic, you tell stories about campaigns no one remembers and wars that made no sense even when they were happening. You might get a coin or two from a passing noble who thinks you're quaint, like a broken statue or a particularly sad dog. But mostly, you're part of the scenery now, a reminder that glory has an expiration date. And yet, the Roman army kept going, for centuries, because it worked. The system, cruel, exhausting, often wildly inefficient, turned men into marching, stabbing, digging, enduring machines. It wasn't about your feelings, your hopes, or whether you missed your mum. It was about holding the line, even if your legs were numb and your sandals smelled like death in a leather sack. That's what made Rome terrifying. Not just the weapons or the numbers, but the sheer willingness to grind human beings into infrastructure. Legionaries didn't just fight battles, They built roads, aqueducts, siege engines, and the occasional emotionally repressed empire. They didn't get sick days or comfort animals or ergonomic anything. They got shouted at by a guy with a vine stick and the dead eyes of someone who'd seen 12 winters in Germania and lost 4 toes to frostbite and a rat named Flavius. And they still showed up every morning, ready to do it again. So, the next time you see a movie where Roman soldiers charge gloriously across a field, just remember, those guys hadn't eaten fresh food in weeks. Their armor smelled like a dead goat's armpit, and they were probably thinking less about glory and more about how much pus was leaking from their foot blisters. Glory wasn't the goal. Survival was. If you could make it through your term and hobble out the other side with most of your limbs, you were considered successful. If you could tell a story and spit without coughing up blood, even better. And sure, modern life has its problems, rent, traffic, emails. But at least you're not digging a latrine at midnight while wearing 50 pounds of gear and being yelled at in Latin by a man who's convinced you're the reason his wife left. So, would you have survived a day in a Roman legion? Honestly, honey, you would have sprained something putting on the sandals. You'd have cried in the first 10 minutes and tried to fake a leg cramp. And even if you stuck it out, you'd spend the next quarter century learning that pain, suffering and blister management were a lifestyle, not a temporary condition. But, hey, at least you'd have great calf muscles. Alright, that's enough trauma for one night. You're free to go, unlike most Roman soldiers. Be nice to your feet, drink some actual water, and if you enjoyed this, maybe subscribe before your attention span resets. Drive safe, sleep tight, or continue lying to yourself about just one more video. I believe in you, and see you in the next episode.